What would you do if a fortune fell into your lap, but it was wrapped in a mystery and tied with a threat? If the price of your salvation was confronting a ghost you never knew, and a monster you never saw coming? For one woman, a dusty letter promising an inheritance was not the end of her struggle, but the terrifying beginning. The year is 1887. For Amelia Vance, the world had shrunk to the four peeling walls of a rented room in dusty San Mosial, a town gasping for breath on the banks of the Rio Grande. The air was thick with coal smoke from the passing trains and the finer, more persistent dust of poverty. Her husband, a good man with bad luck, had been taken by a fever 2 years prior, leaving her with his quiet affection as a memory and his considerable debts as a daily reality. She survived on mending torn shirts for railroad men and stitching dresses for the few women in town who could afford such luxuries. Her fingers were perpetually pricked and sore, her back ached, and her future was a barren horizon, as empty as the desert stretching out from the edge of town. Each sunrise was a fresh accounting of what she lacked. Each sunset, a quiet surrender. Then came the letter. It was an anomaly, a crisp white envelope amidst the usual brown bills and faded circulars. The postmark was from a place she'd never heard of, Cinder Valley, in the Northern Territories. The solicitor's name was embossed in stark black ink. Her hands, rough from lye soap and needlework, trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside, the language was formal, cold, yet the words themselves were a thunderclap. A woman named Hester Croft had passed away. A complete stranger. And this stranger had, for reasons the letter did not specify, bequeathed her entire estate to Amelia. The estate was an apple orchard, complete with a farmhouse and several acres of land. A home. A whole world. The breath caught in her throat, a knot of disbelief and dizzying hope. But then, the condition. A single, sharp clause that felt less like a stipulation and more like a test. To claim full, unencumbered ownership and the right to sell the property, she was required to reside on the farm for 1 continuous year. 1 year. In a place she did not know, left to her by a woman she had never met. Failure to comply would result in the property being forfeited to a distant relative of the deceased. Her first instinct was suspicion. It was a trick. A cruel joke played by a universe that had, until now, shown her only its harshest face. But the solicitor's letter was real. The details were precise. It was a lifeline, however strange its shape. To stay in San Mosial was to slowly suffocate. To accept this offer was to step off a cliff into the unknown. But at the bottom of that cliff, there might be solid ground. She spent one last night listening to the lonely whistle of the midnight train, then packed her few belongings, her husband's photograph, a spare dress, her sewing kit, and used the last of her savings to buy a one-way ticket north. The dust of her old life clung to her hem as she boarded the train, a ghost leaving a ghost town. The journey was a long, rattling exorcism, shedding one landscape for another. The flat, sun-baked expanse of the south gave way to rolling hills, then to the jagged, pine-stubbled teeth of distant mountains. The air grew cooler, cleaner, smelling of damp earth instead of dry dust. After the train, a bone-jarring stagecoach ride took her the final leg. When the driver finally called out, "Croft's Orchard," Amelia stepped out and felt the world tilt. It was beautiful. Terribly, achingly beautiful, and utterly neglected. Gnarled, ancient apple trees stood in crooked rows, their branches reaching like arthritic fingers toward a slate-gray sky. Many were heavy with fruit, small and green, but others were skeletal, their bark peeling away to reveal pale, dead wood. The farmhouse stood on a slight rise, a 2-story structure of weathered gray timber with a sagging porch and dark, vacant windows that stared back at her like hollow eyes. It was a place of deep, profound silence, broken only by the rustle of wind through the overgrown grass. This was her inheritance. A kingdom of decay. As she approached the house, a figure emerged from the shadows of a large barn. He was an old man, bent but not broken, with a face carved from granite and tanned to the color of old leather. His eyes, a startlingly pale blue, were narrowed with a suspicion that bordered on hostility. "You the one from the letter?" he asked. His voice was a low growl, like stones grinding together. "I am. Amelia Vance." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. Jedediah Thorne. I worked the place for Hester. Still do. I suppose he didn't offer a hand, just stood there, a human wall between her and the house. It's a lot to take in, Amelia managed, her gaze sweeping over the tangled orchard. More than you know, he grunted. He squinted at her, a long, appraising look. Hester was a private woman. Kept to herself. For good reason. He paused, chewing on his thoughts. You're a city woman. Soft hands. This place. It eats soft things. I'm not as soft as I look, Amelia said, a spark of defiance kindling within her. Jedediah almost smiled. It was a grim, fleeting thing. We'll see. He gestured toward the house with his chin. Keys under the loose stone by the stoop. Word of advice. Some doors are best left shut. Some things are better left buried. The warning hung in the air, cold and sharp as the autumn chill. It was not the welcome she had expected, but it was, perhaps, the one she needed. His words followed her as she found the heavy iron key and pushed open the front door. The house sighed as she entered, a gust of stale, musty air breathing out to greet her. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the shafts of light piercing the grimy windows. The furniture was draped in white sheets, silent, shrouded forms in the gloom. It felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Over the next few days, Amelia fought to impose her will on the house. She pulled off the sheets, beating clouds of dust from them in the yard. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, and aired out the rooms, trying to chase away the scent of disuse and sorrow. The house resisted. The floorboards groaned under her feet. The wind moaned in the chimney. At night, the silence was so absolute it felt loud, a pressure against her eardrums. She felt watched, a trespasser in someone else's life, in someone else's death. Jedediah was a constant, taciturn presence. He worked the orchard from dawn until dusk, pruning the living trees and clearing the dead ones, his movements methodical and imbued with a kind of weary reverence. He answered her questions with clipped, non-committal phrases. When she asked about the dead trees, he mumbled about a blight from a few years back. When she asked about Hester, he'd just shake his head. Lived alone. Died alone, but his eyes, whenever he looked at the house, held a deep, troubled knowledge. He was guarding a secret, and the entire farm seemed to be its vault. The feeling of being an intruder was strongest in the root cellar. It was a dark, stone-lined space, cool and smelling of damp earth and phantom apples. Against the far wall, beneath a set of dusty shelves holding empty canning jars, was a low, sturdy wooden door. It was made of thick, dark planks, bound with iron, and fitted with a heavy, rusted lock. It was out of place, too robust for a simple storage closet. Curiosity gnawed at her. She tried the ring of old keys she'd found in the kitchen. None of them fit. She pushed and pulled, but it was solid, unyielding. It was the physical manifestation of Jedediah's warning. Some doors are best left shut. This was one of them. Its silent, stubborn presence became an obsession. What was Hester Croft hiding? The question echoed in the lonely rooms of the house, in the rustle of the apple leaves, in the unsettling silence of the nights. The farm was not just land and a house, it was a question, and she was beginning to fear the answer. The first cliffhanger beat was the discovery of this locked door, a tangible piece of the mystery. A week into her unsettling new life, the rhythm of her isolation was broken. A rider appeared on the horizon, not on a workhorse like Jedediah's, but on a sleek black stallion that moved with an arrogant grace. The man atop it was dressed in a fine city suit, a stark black figure against the rustic greens and browns of the orchard. He dismounted with a fluid motion and approached the porch where Amelia was mending a tear in one of the dust sheets. He removed his hat, revealing a handsome, sharp-featured face and a smile that was perfectly white and utterly without warmth. "Mrs. Vance? Amelia Vance?" His voice was smooth, cultured, a sound that did not belong here. "Yes," she said, her hand instinctively tightening on the needle. "Sterling Blackwood," he announced, bowing slightly. "A pleasure. I am, or was, a distant cousin to the late Hester Croft." Amelia stood, her guard immediately up. He was the distant relative as mentioned in the solicitor's letter. Mr. Blackwood. Please, call me Sterling. His eyes, a shade of dark, polished obsidian, roamed over the farmhouse, a flicker of something, impatience. Distaste, crossing his features before the pleasant mask slipped back into place. I was so sorry to hear of Hester's passing. A tragedy. She was. A unique soul. He made it sound like an affliction. I never had the chance to meet her, Amelia said quietly. No, of course not. She cut herself off from everyone. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a confidential tone. Which is why I've come. I understand the terms of the will are somewhat restrictive. A full year of residency. It's an absurd condition, designed by a lonely old woman to force company upon herself, even in death. He paused, letting his words sink in. Frankly, Mrs. Vance, this is no place for a lady of your refinement. The isolation, the labor, it's a burden. An unfair 1 inch. I manage, she said, her voice cooler than she intended. Sterling's smile didn't falter. I'm sure you do. But why should you have to? I am prepared to make you an offer. I will buy this farm from you. Right now. For a sum that will see you comfortable for the rest of your days. We can have my lawyers handle the legal complexities of the residency clause. Think of it. You could be back in civilization by the end of the week, free of all this. He waved a dismissive hand at the orchard, at the house, at her entire inheritance. The offer was staggering. The amount he named was a fortune, far more than a neglected apple farm could possibly be worth. It was enough to erase her past and secure her future 10 times over. The temptation was a physical thing, a sweet, dizzying rush. Freedom. But then, Jedediah's words echoed in her mind. Some things are better left buried. Why was this man so desperate to possess this specific piece of land? Why overpay so extravagantly? His eagerness was a blaring alarm. Why? Amelia asked, her voice steady. Why is this place so important to you? Sterling's eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. The mask slipped. Sentimentality, he said, the word sounding like a lie. Family land. It means a great deal. It seems to mean a great deal more than just sentiment, she countered, her suspicion solidifying into resolve. The price you offer is generous to a fault. His smile finally vanished, replaced by a chilling stillness. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she was no longer a widow to be pitied but an obstacle to be removed. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice dropping, the false civility stripped away to reveal the cold metal beneath. Everyone has a price. I am offering you an easy way. The other way is not so pleasant. This land has a habit of rejecting people. It would be a regrettable decision to try and make it your home. The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the quiet air between them. It was not a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. I think, Amelia said, her heart hammering against her ribs, I will take my chances with the land. The answer is no, Mr. Blackwood. He held her gaze for a long moment, his obsidian eyes promising consequences. He placed his hat back on his head with a slow, deliberate motion. A regrettable decision indeed, he repeated softly. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a silence that was heavier and more menacing than before. The mystery of the farm now had a face, and it was a handsome, smiling, predatory one. Sterling's visit lit a fire under Amelia. The vague unease she'd felt had now crystallized into palpable fear. He didn't just want the farm, he wanted something on the farm. Something he was willing to bribe, threaten, and likely kill for. And whatever it was probably behind the locked door in the cellar. She went to find Jedediah, who was sharpening a scythe near the barn, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel setting her teeth on edge. He was here, she said, foregoing any preamble. Sterling Blackwood. Jedediah stopped his work. He didn't look at her, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the sharpening stone. Figured he'd show his face. He tried to buy the farm. He threatened me when I refused. That's his way, Jedediah grunted, resuming the scraping, faster this time. Scrape. 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 There's a locked door in the root cellar, Amelia pressed on. I think the answer is behind it. I need to get it open. He finally looked up, his pale eyes full of a weary, ancient pain. I told you, some doors. They're shut for a reason. And I told you, I'm not as soft as I look, she shot back, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He is not scaring me off this land. Hester left it to me. I need to know why. I need your help, Jedediah. He stared at her for a long time, a silent battle raging behind his eyes. He saw not a soft city woman, but someone with a spine of steel, someone who, like Hester, would not be broken. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, he dropped the stone. Get the lantern, he said. And fetch the crowbar from the barn. The cellar was colder than before, the air thick with the smell of secrets. Jedediah held the lantern high, its golden light casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel alive and hostile. He stood before the small, iron-bound door and studied it. Hester put this in herself, 'bout 15 years back, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Said she needed a place for things that were precious and dangerous. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam between the door and the frame. He grunted with effort, the muscles in his old arms cording. Wood splintered. Rusted metal groaned in protest. With a final, violent crack, the lock shattered and the door swung inward into blackness. It wasn't a room. It was a small, dry-walled cavity, barely large enough for a person to crawl inside. And sitting squarely in the middle of the dusty floor was a heavy, metal lockbox. Amelia's heart pounded. She reached in and dragged it out into the lantern light. It was unlocked. With trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cheesecloth, was not gold or jewels, but a single, leather-bound journal. Hester Croft's name was embossed on the cover in faded gold leaf. Amelia carried it upstairs to the kitchen table as if it were a holy relic. Jedediah followed, standing silently by the door, a grim sentinel. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a stark contrast to the terrifying story it began to tell. As Amelia read, the silence of the farmhouse became charged with the ghosts of the past. Page by page, Hester's elegant script unspooled a story of hope, betrayal, and murder. She and her husband, a geologist by training, hadn't bought the orchard for the apples. They'd bought it for the rock formations. Years ago, her husband had discovered a small but incredibly rich vein of silver deep within the hillside, accessible through a natural cave system whose entrance was on their property. They took on a young, ambitious partner to help finance the initial excavation, a charming investor named Sterling Blackwood. For a time, it was a prosperous and hopeful partnership. But Sterling's ambition curdled into greed. He wanted it all. The journal described, in chillingly dispassionate detail, the day of the accident and arranged rockslide in the mine. A support beam Sterling had inspected himself that morning. Her husband was crushed, his death ruled a tragic misfortune. Sterling immediately tried to buy Hester's half of the claim, assuming the grieving widow would be easy to manipulate. But Hester was not easy. She knew, with a certainty that chilled Amelia to the bone, that Sterling had murdered her husband. But she had no proof. So she did the only thing she could. She refused to sell. She sealed the mine entrance herself, triggering a second, larger rockslide to hide it completely, burying the silver and the memory of her husband together. Then, she waited. The journal became a chronicle of her self-imposed imprisonment. Sterling's campaign of terror began with poisoned wells and sick livestock. Then came that blight Jedediah had spoken of, not a natural disease, but a chemical poison Sterling had his men sneak in to spray on the trees at night, an attempt to ruin the farm and financially choke her out. Hester documented every dead tree, every threat, every shadow she saw flitting at the edge of her property. She became a recluse not out of eccentricity, but for survival. This farm was her fortress, and the journal was her weapon, her testimony. In the final entries, her health failing, Hester wrote of her search for an heir. She couldn't leave the farm to anyone in the valley. Sterling would have bought or intimidated them in a week. She needed an outsider. A stranger. Someone with nothing to lose and, perhaps, the grit to fight. Through a distant acquaintance, she'd heard of a young woman recently widowed in San Mosiel, a woman known for her quiet fortitude, a woman named Amelia Vance. She chose me, Amelia whispered, looking up from the page, her eyes wide with shock and a terrifying sense of purpose. The last page contained a hand-drawn map. It showed the layout of the orchard, marking a specific, ancient apple tree scarred by a lightning strike. Next to it, an X marked the spot labeled, main entrance, covered by slide. Unstable ground north of scar, beware ventilation shaft. She finally understood. The inheritance wasn't just a gift. It was a charge. A baton passed in a desperate relay. Hester hadn't just given her a farm, she had given her a war. As the final, damning words of the journal settled in the room, Amelia looked at Jedediah. His face was a mask of anguish, the granite features seeming to crumble under the weight of a guilt he'd carried for 15 years. "You knew," Amelia said. "It wasn't a question. You were there." He finally broke, slumping against the doorframe as if his legs could no longer hold him. "I was young," he rasped, his voice thick with shame. "Just a boy, hired on by Blackwood for the digging. I needed the money. He seemed like a god, paying in gold coin. His eyes were distant, seeing a past she could only read about. I saw him sawing through that support beam the morning of the collapse. He told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd be in the next one. He gave me a pouch of silver dollars. He looked at his hands, calloused and worn, as if he could still feel the phantom weight of the blood money. I took it. And I ran. He couldn't stay away. The guilt was a cancer. A few years later, he'd returned, a changed man, and begged Hester for work, never telling her who he was or what he'd done. He spent the next decade watching over her from a distance, a silent, failed guardian, his daily labor a constant, agonizing act of penance. I tried to protect her, he choked out. Tried to make up for it. But I was a coward then, and I've been a coward ever since. Before Amelia could process his confession, a sound shattered the heavy silence. The frantic, terrified whinny of a horse from the barn, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood. They both froze. "His back," Jedediah whispered, his face paling. "And he ain't here to talk." Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded Amelia's veins. She grabbed the journal. "The map," she said, her mind racing. "The unstable ground." Jedediah's head snapped up, a new light in his eyes. Not of fear, but of grim resolve. A lifetime of cowardice was about to be paid for in one night. "He don't know the land like I do. Not the dark places." He grabbed an old, heavy iron poker from beside the cold fireplace. "Go. Out the back. Head for the lightning tree. Don't let him get that book. What about you?" "I'm gonna buy you time," he said, and for the first time, he looked her square in the eye, the farmer and the widow, allies bound by a dead woman's legacy. "It's a debt I gotta pay." He didn't wait for an answer. He moved toward the front of the house as the heavy thud of boots hit the porch. Amelia fled through the back kitchen door, clutching the journal to her chest, and plunged into the disorienting darkness of the orchard. The moon was hidden by thick clouds, turning the familiar rows of trees into a treacherous, black labyrinth. Behind her, she heard the front door crash open, followed by Sterling's enraged shout. "The journal! Find her!" She ran, her city lungs burning, her feet stumbling over roots and fallen apples. The rustle of her own passage sounded deafeningly loud. She could hear them behind her, 2, maybe 3 of them, crashing through the undergrowth like beasts. They were clumsy, loud. They didn't know the land. She forced herself to think, to remember the map. The lightning tree was on the far western edge of the property, where the ground sloped steeply upward. She veered left, using the denser, unpruned section of the orchard for cover. Branches whipped at her face, tearing at her dress. Every snap of a twig sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. A shout from behind and to her right told her they were splitting up, trying to flank her. She had to be faster. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm her, she heard a different sound. A roar of fury, the solid thwack of iron meeting flesh, and Jedediah's voice, not a coward's whisper but a warrior's yell, echoing through the trees. He had intercepted them. He was keeping his promise. Amelia didn't dare look back. She used the precious seconds he had bought her, her gratitude a painful lump in her throat. She scrambled up the incline, the ground growing softer, more yielding underfoot. And then she saw it, a stark, pale silhouette against the slightly less black sky, the lightning-scarred apple tree, its split trunk like a ghostly hand pointing to the heavens. She was here. She remembered the warning, unstable ground north of Scar. She circled around the massive trunk, putting it between her and the sounds of the struggle below. She found what she was looking for, a wide, deceptively flat patch of ground covered in weeds and loose soil. The hidden ventilation shaft. Footsteps pounded up the hill behind her. A single set. He was alone. Sterling burst into the small clearing, his fine suit torn, his face scratched and contorted with rage. He saw her, and his eyes fixed on the journal in her hands. "Give it to me," he snarled, advancing on her. "It's over." "It was over for you the day you killed her husband," Amelia retorted, backing away slowly, deliberately drawing him across the clearing, toward the shaft. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He was a fool. And Hester was a stubborn old crone. Just like you, he lunged, not for the book, but for her. Amelia did the only thing she could. She threw the journal. It flew through the air, landing several feet to her left. For a split second, Sterling's eyes followed it, his greed overriding his attack. It was the moment she needed. As he course-corrected, his boot landed squarely on the rotted timbers and packed earth hiding the shaft. There was a sickening crack of old wood. A look of pure, uncomprehending shock flashed across his face. The ground simply vanished beneath him. He gave one short, sharp cry as he plunged into the blackness. The sound was swallowed by the earth, followed by a distant, final thud. Then, silence. A profound, absolute silence that was deeper than any she had yet experienced on this farm. The first rays of dawn were breaking as the sheriff, summoned by a boy Jedediah had paid his last silver dollar to before the fight, arrived with his deputies. They found Amelia sitting by the lightning tree, the journal in her lap, covered in dirt and scratches but otherwise unharmed. They found Jedediah near the barn, unconscious but alive, a deep gash on his head but a strangely peaceful expression on his face. Sterling Blackwood's hired men were tied up nearby. Of Sterling himself, there was no sign but the gaping, black maw of the ventilation shaft. He was gone, swallowed by the very land he had tried to steal. In the weeks that followed, the story came out. Jedediah's testimony, corroborated by Hester's meticulous journal, sealed the fate of Sterling's men and cleared Amelia's claim to the land entirely. The one-year clause was rendered moot. The farm, and the silver mine beneath it, was hers. Unconditionally. Everyone expected her to sell. To hire a mining company, extract the fortune, and disappear back into the civilized world she came from. It was the logical choice. But as she stood on the porch of the now quiet farmhouse, looking out over the orchard, she saw not a burden or a battlefield, but a legacy. She saw the gnarled, resilient trees that had survived poison and neglect. She saw the spot where Jedediah had made his stand, and the house where Hester had mounted her quiet, 15-year defense. She ran a hand over the weathered railing, feeling the grain of the wood, the history. This land wasn't just a source of wealth, it was a source of strength. It had taken everything from Hester, and in turn, it had given everything to Amelia, a purpose, a fight, a home. She would not sell. She would stay. She would hire hands to help her bring the orchard back to life, to honor the woman who chose her. The silver could stay in the ground, a silent testament to the greed it had inspired. The real treasure, she realized, was the rich soil under her feet and the clean, crisp air in her lungs. She had arrived a destitute widow searching for a lifeline. She had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found herself. So we ask you again, when faced with a fortune born from tragedy, do you take the money and run, or do you choose to cultivate the ground where the ghosts of the past lie buried? What priceless thing would you unearth? Let us know your choice in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories of fortunes found and secrets uncovered, be sure to like this video and subscribe.